I never expected to become a parent at 18, but life has a way of throwing unexpected curveballs at you. My older sister had a baby boy when I was still in my final year of high school. She was 22 at the time, and from the moment my nephew was born, it was clear that neither she nor her boyfriend wanted anything to do with him. I couldn't bear to see that innocent baby being treated like an unwanted burden. My grandmother, one of the kindest souls I've ever known, helped me take care of him while I finished high school. We worked out a deal where I'd cook and clean for her on weekends in exchange for her watching him during school days. My parents weren't much help, tossing a measly $100 our way each month for the baby's expenses. Anyone who's raised a child knows that's barely enough to cover diapers. The situation got worse a year after I graduated. My parents' sister and her now husband decided they'd had enough of us. They kicked us out, with my sister coldly stating she wished she'd never given birth to him. That was the moment I knew I had to step up completely. My grandmother and I immediately consulted a family lawyer, and I got full custody while my sister signed away her rights. Life wasn't easy, but we made it work. I lived with my grandmother while attending community college and working part-time. She was our rock, watching my boy while I juggled education and work. We had settled into a routine, but then everything changed when my grandmother passed away when my son was 6. She left most of her belongings to me in her will, which suddenly made my parents and sister interested in reconnecting with us. Their intentions weren't genuine, they just wanted a piece of the inheritance. I gave them an ultimatum: either be genuinely involved in our lives or stay away completely. My dad surprised me by choosing to actually build a real relationship with us. We became close over time, while my mom remained distant but civil, at least treating my son kindly when she saw him. Things were looking up. When my boy was 5, I met someone special. My now husband spent a year getting to know me before I introduced him to my son, wanting to make sure this relationship was serious before bringing someone new into my child's life. My husband treated my son as his own from day one. We got married when my boy was 7, and when he turned 9 we made it official through adoption, with his full agreement, of course. But just when everything seemed perfect, my sister dropped another bomb. She was pregnant at the same time as me, and suddenly she wanted my son back. She started poisoning his mind, telling him that once my biological child arrived, we wouldn't love him anymore. We only discovered this when our boy broke down one day, sobbing and begging us not to abandon him. My heart shattered into a million pieces seeing him so scared. We immediately started family therapy and got him individual counseling too. When my second son was born, we made sure to shower both our boys with equal love and attention, showing our firstborn that he would always be just as much our son as his brother. 2 years after that incident, my sister reached out again. After discussing it with my husband and our older son, we decided to maintain limited contact with her. By this time, our family was doing well financially. We could afford extracurricular activities for both boys, nice presents, and even took annual family vacations. My sister and her husband, on the other hand, were struggling to make ends meet. When my niece turned 9, my sister started making demands. She'd constantly hint that I should pay for things for her daughter, but I stood my ground. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't heartless. I bought my niece nice birthday and Christmas presents, took her out occasionally, but I didn't treat her the same way I treated my own children. Why would I? She had her own parents. The real drama started when my younger son was turning 17. My husband and I had plans to get him a starter car, just like we'd done for our older boy at the same age. Somehow, my sister got wind of this and told my niece she'd be getting a car too. But here's the thing, my sister couldn't afford a car. Instead of being honest with her daughter, she tried to push that responsibility onto me. When I refused to buy my niece a car, my sister stopped talking to me for a while. Then, after we surprised my son with his car, all hell broke loose. My niece called me, crying and screaming, demanding to know why I hated her and why I couldn't treat her the same as her brother. I had to be straight with her. I explained that while I loved her as my niece, that's all she was to me. An aunt's job is to give birthday presents, Christmas gifts, and show up for important events. Nothing more, nothing less. She didn't take it well. The screaming got louder before she hung up on me. Then my sister called to yell at me too, saying I needed to do more. I told her straight up that none of this would have happened if she hadn't promised her daughter something she couldn't deliver herself. The next few days were hell. My phone kept ringing with calls from various family members and my sister's friends, all calling me names and telling me how horrible I was. Even though I stood firm in my decision, A small part of me felt guilty. Maybe I could have done more. But then again, why should I have to make up for my sister's shortcomings as a parent? After all the drama, I decided to meet with my niece at a park near my house. She seemed tired but calmer than during our phone call. I tried to explain that I never meant to hurt her, but she needed to understand that I wasn't her parent. She said she understood but admitted she was jealous that my boys seemed to get everything they wanted. I had to correct her there. First, I reminded her that my older son wasn't her brother but her cousin. Second, I explained that my boys didn't just get everything they wanted, they worked for what they got. Good grades, doing their chores, staying out of trouble. Everything came with responsibility. When I pressed her about why this was suddenly such a big issue when it hadn't been before, she broke down completely. Through her tears, she told me it wasn't fair that my older son lucked out by being adopted by us, that she deserved the same things my boys had. She felt like just an obligation to her parents, while she could see how our family worked together and supported each other. The conversation took an even harder turn when she said that since I took in my older son, I should have no problem taking her in too. I had to be firm. While I loved her as my niece, I wasn't going to treat her as my child. I hadn't raised her from infancy like I had my older son. She got more upset, claiming I clearly didn't care about her, and stormed off. After that conversation, my husband and I decided it was time for a clean break. We called my sister and announced we were going no contact. When she asked about contact with her daughter, I simply said that since my niece was almost an adult, she could reach out to me if she wanted to. My sister tried one last time to get a car for her daughter, but I stood firm and hung up. The drama wasn't over though. The next day, my mom called, trying to convince me to at least give my niece money for a car. I refused and hung up, knowing it would only lead to more arguments. When I called my dad to explain everything, he supported my decision. But then he showed up at our house a few days later with shocking news. My mom had given a huge chunk of their retirement fund to my sister, causing a massive fight between my parents. My dad was so upset he'd moved into a motel. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, my niece agreed to meet at my house for a private talk. At first, she could barely look at me, but when I offered a hug, she broke down crying and apologized for her behavior. We had a long, honest conversation about her home life. She admitted that while her dad treated her well despite working 2 jobs, her mom was distant and made her feel like an obligation. They argued constantly about money, and family time was rare. She also confessed that she'd called my older son her brother, hoping it would convince me to help her. She knew they were really just cousins, and her dad had told her the truth about how I ended up adopting my older son, while her mom had sugar-coated everything. I offered to pay for therapy for her, and we started planning regular Saturday outings together. Things were looking up until I had to cancel one of our plans because my younger son had a severe asthma attack during football practice and ended up in the hospital. Before I could explain why I was canceling, she exploded at me and hung up. I tried calling and texting to explain, but she wouldn't respond. 2 days later, everything fell apart completely. During a family night out, our neighbors called saying someone was vandalizing my younger son's car. When we got home, we found the car covered in scratches and dents, with 2 broken windows. Our security footage clearly showed my niece and her friend doing the damage. We had to involve the police, and they were both arrested. The next morning, my sister and mom showed up at our house, screaming that I was ruining my niece's life and should drop the charges if I really loved her. My husband was adamant about pressing charges, and both our boys agreed. When I talked to my older son about everything, he said he was done with all of it, and that my niece was turning out just like her mom. So that was it. We cut contact with everyone except my dad. Looking back now, I wonder if things could have been different. But I know I did the best I could as both a mother and an aunt. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when it hurts.